He sold our shared home, stole the money, and left me his paralyzed wife for a young nurse. 3 years later, he came back asking for forgiveness. But I was no longer the same woman. If you think this is just another family story, you're mistaken. Subscribe now for more soul-stirring African family stories. Who would have thought the deepest wounds don't live in the body, but in trust? The air was thick that evening in Accra. The monsoon clouds had rolled in from the Gulf, heavy and swollen with unspent rain, but the city below stayed defiant, alive with horns, fire-grilled street food voices, bargaining under flickering street lamps. At the heart of this restless sprawl within the brightly lit corridors of Kora General Hospital, a young man in navy scrubs stood hunched over a blood test report. Dr. Kwame Mensah didn't notice the hum of the vending machine behind him, or the intern slipping by with 2 cups of instant coffee. His brow furrowed, lips tight, he read the lab values again. Malaria. Late stage. Complications likely. He scribbled notes, quickly tucked the file under his arm, and turned with the kind of intensity only young doctors on night duty could afford. This was Kwame's 3rd night in a row. He moved with a precise, practiced energy, nodding at nurses, adjusting IV drips, reading vitals. Behind every stethoscope and clipped instruction was a man haunted by the weight of responsibility. At 29, Kwame was already gaining a reputation. Brilliant, driven, empathetic. But none of those things shielded him from exhaustion or from the ache of absence. Because while Kwame was here among the sick, the dying, the bleeding, his wife Abena was elsewhere, spinning stories with her body beneath the amber stage lights of the Adum Cultural Theater. Abena Mensah, a name known far beyond Accra. A goddess of rhythm, they said. Her arms painted the wind, her feet carried the thunder of ancestral memory. Her dance was not just movement, it was invocation. Especially the Adowa. Tonight she was rehearsing for Homowo, the great festival of the Ga people. She had performed it dozens of times, but this one mattered. An ambassador from Ethiopia was scheduled to attend. International exposure, sponsorship. The stakes were higher than ever. Her troupe gathered in the open-air hall, moving through choreography, while Abena watched and corrected. Wofa ama slower with your turn. Think of the mourning drums. The elders will feel that beat in their bones. She didn't raise her voice, but everyone listened. Always. She wasn't just the lead dancer. She was the spirit of the ensemble. She was also a mother and a wife. A woman who once dreamed of nursing, but chose dance instead because rhythm made her feel alive. Who gave up a scholarship abroad to marry the man she loved? To stay in Ghana, to build something with him. Tonight, though, she felt a twinge in her lower back, nothing unusual. But the floorboards beneath her were older than they looked, softened from years of rain and sweat. As she lifted into a spin, the sound came first, a crack, sharp and unmistakable. Then nothing. Then the rush. Her world tilted. The wooden panel gave way. And she dropped hard and fast. Her back hit a hidden iron brace below the stage. A gasp, a scream, then silence. Abena didn't black out immediately. She remembered the taste of her own panic, sharp like iron in her throat. She tried to move her legs. Nothing. She tried again. Nothing. The dancers surrounded her, calling her name. Her arms trembled, fingers clawing the dusty wood. Someone ran for help. Back at Koraya, General Kwame's phone buzzed violently on the nurse's station desk. He didn't check it at first. Another lab report. Another patient family inquiring. But then it rang again. Same number. Again. He wiped his hands on his coat, picked it up. He didn't even get to say hello before the voice spilled through, frantic, breathless. Dr. Mensah, please, it's your wife. It's Abena. There's been an accident. His world stilled. What happened? He barked, already standing. Where is she? She fell through the stage floor. She can't feel her legs. They're bringing her to Ridge Emergency. They said it's serious. Kwame didn't answer. He didn't hang up either. He simply dropped the phone on the counter and took off down the hallway. The hospital staff called after him, confused. A nurse tried to follow. Dr. Mensah, where are you?" He was already gone. The hospital exit doors flung open, the humid night rushing in. Kwame's car, a faded green Corolla, screeched out of the lot 2 minutes later. He didn't wait for traffic signals. He didn't hear the angry shouts of trotro drivers or the shrill whistles of police at intersections. His hands trembled on the wheel. His mind wasn't in the car. It was behind him in a warm kitchen, Abena humming old Yue lullabies while feeding their daughter, Amma. It was in their bedroom, her hair spilling over the pillow, her laugh full and wild, echoing off their apartment walls, her feet brushing his leg in sleep. Now all he could see was her lying broken. He whispered to no one, "Please God, don't let this be real." The emergency entrance of Ridge Hospital buzzed with activity. Nurses in pale blue scrubs wheeled stretchers past waiting families. Children cried in the background. A man paced barefoot, clutching his side blood soaking his wrapper. And in the middle of it all stood a doctor, still in his scrubs, drenched in sweat eyes, wild, demanding answers. "I'm looking for my wife, Abena Mensah. They said she was brought in." The receptionist glanced down, then nodded. "She's in trauma surgery. Room 3. They're working on stabilizing her." "What's the status?" Kwame snapped. "I don't know yet, doctor. Please have a seat." But he didn't. He paced. He clenched his jaw. He stared at the swinging doors, begging to see someone he recognized. 35 minutes passed. Then a surgeon emerged, older, composed with a hint of sadness in his expression. He scanned the room. His eyes landed on Kwame. "Dr. Mensah." Kwame stepped forward. "Yes, that's me." The man exhaled slowly. "She's alive," he said. Kwame closed his eyes. Relief hit like a wave, but it didn't last. But there's damage. Severe damage. The impact was direct to her lower spine. The vertebrae were shattered, and her spinal cord has suffered permanent trauma. Kwame opened his eyes. "What does that mean?" The surgeon didn't sugarcoat it. "She's paralyzed, doctor. From the waist down. It's irreversible." Kwame didn't speak. The hallway spun a little. The buzz of fluorescent lights above felt deafening. The surgeon placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry. We've done all we can." Kwame's lips parted, but no words came. He nodded once. Just once. A nurse led him into the ICU, where Abena lay unconscious. Tubes threaded from her arms. Her head was tilted slightly to one side, mouth slack, eyelids fluttering. Machines beeped in measured rhythm, indifferent to the grief pressing into Kwame's ribs. He stood by her bed. Her face still beautiful, still hers was pale. But it wasn't the same. Something vital had gone out of her. Kwame took her hand gently. It was warm, familiar. "Abena," he whispered. She didn't stir. "Come back to me." He kissed the back of her hand. A tear slipped down his cheek. Their daughter Amma was still at home with her aunt, likely asleep, unaware that everything she knew was about to change. The family, once golden, was about to enter a storm it may never survive. Outside, thunder cracked. The first drops of rain began to fall on the streets of Accra. And inside that sterile white room, a love story fractured quietly, irrevocably. The golden dream had broken, and nothing would ever be the same again. The hum of the ceiling fan did little to break the thick, choking stillness that had settled over their apartment. It was the kind of silence that made the air feel heavier, as if it too was grieving. Kwame stood by the edge of the bed, his bed, their bed, and looked down at the woman who once danced through life like she had wings. Now she lay motionless, her face turned toward the shuttered window, eyes wide open but vacant, blank like a screen stuck between frames. It had been 3 days since Abena returned home from the hospital. 3 days since Kwame brought her up in his arms, cradling her like something fragile and irreplaceable. Her body was thinner than he remembered. Her wrists looked like they didn't belong to her. Her hair had lost its luster. But what terrified him most wasn't her broken spine or the long scars down her back. It was her silence. "Time to sit up, my love," Kwame said gently, as he reached down to adjust the pillows behind her. She didn't respond. He moved slowly, slipping one hand under her shoulders and the other under her thighs. Her body resisted dead weight now, and he grunted slightly as he shifted her upright. She winced, but didn't complain. "Are you okay?" he asked. No answer. "Abena, if it hurts, just say something. I'll be careful." She turned her face away, eyes scanning the far wall. He sighed, placing a folded blanket behind her for support. Every morning since her return had gone like this. The same silence, the same distant gaze, the same weight not just of her body, but of something heavier. Something intangible bearing down on both of them. Kwam walked to the small kitchenette, poured a cup of warm millet porridge, and returned to her side. "Here, you need to eat something." He sat beside her on the edge of the bed. "Dr. Ansa said you need strength before rehab can begin." Abena blinked slowly. Kwam stirred the porridge and brought a spoon to her lips. She turned away. "Abena," he said, more firm now, "you have to eat." "I'm not hungry." Her voice was barely a whisper. "You said that yesterday. You've barely touched anything in days." "I don't want it." He paused, then set the bowl down, trying to control the frustration swelling inside him. He had read about this. Emotional resistance, depression, the brain's reaction to sudden trauma. He'd seen it in patients. But this wasn't just a patient. This was his wife. He reached for her hand, cold limp, and squeezed it gently. "I'm here," he said. "Okay, I'm not going anywhere." She didn't answer, and somewhere inside him a tiny crack formed. Later that afternoon, he sat at the edge of the bathtub, gently pouring water over her back as she sat in the bath chair. The wounds along her spine were healing, but the scar tissue was raw. Her face winced with each touch, though she said nothing. He used a soft cloth, slow circular motions. He washed her hair, combed it out, braided it loosely. These were things she once did while singing. Now, she didn't even look at herself in the mirror. That night, after putting her to bed, Kwame slumped onto the living room couch. His shoulders sagged forward. His white t-shirt was stained with sweat, and his hands smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender shampoo. The house was dim. Their daughter Amma was staying with Kwame's sister for the week. He thought the quiet would help. It didn't. Sleep came in fragments, and each time he closed his eyes, he saw her falling. Heard the crack of wood. Saw the emptiness in her gaze. He returned to work 3 days later, not because he wanted to, but because he had no choice. Bills were stacking up. The hospital had covered some of Abena's surgery costs, but not all. The therapy sessions, medications, equipment, everything came with receipts and red ink. They hadn't anticipated this kind of life. On his first night back at the ER, he barely recognized himself. His stethoscope felt heavier. His hands trembled as he read charts. His white coat looked like it belonged to someone else. It was past midnight when he collapsed into the break room chair, head in hands. His bones ached. His brain throbbed. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't called home. He was scared to. And that's when he heard her voice for the first time. "You look like the ghost of a very tired doctor." He looked up. Efua. She stood in the doorway, a mug in one hand, her hair tied up in a loose scarf. Her scrubs were slightly wrinkled. There was something light in her presence, something undemanding, like shade beneath a harsh sun. She walked over and placed the mug in front of him. "Coffee," she said. "No sugar. You look like you hate sugar." He tried to smile. Failed. "I didn't realize I looked like anything." "You do." She sat opposite him. "You look like someone who's carrying the whole hospital on your back." Kwam stared into the cup. The steam curled upward like a quiet offering. "Thank you," he muttered. They sat in silence for a while, not uncomfortable, just quiet. Then she spoke again. "They told me about your wife, the accident." "I'm sorry." He looked up sharply, alarmed at the mention of Abena. She raised a hand. "I didn't mean to intrude. I've seen you. Before, you were always smiling, moving fast, confident. Now, you're different." Kwame didn't know how to respond. He sipped the coffee. Efua tilted her head. "Is she okay, your wife?" He hesitated. "She's alive." "But she's not there." Efua nodded slowly, understanding more than he expected. "Sometimes," she said, "when the body breaks, it takes the soul with it. Not permanently. but it disappears for a while. Quame looked at her. You sound like someone who's seen that happen before. I have, she said. My father. Stroke. Couldn't speak for 6 months. My mother gave up. I didn't. And did he come back? She smiled faintly. Eventually. But not as the same man. Quame set the mug down. That's what I'm afraid of. That she's not coming back. That I'll be living with a ghost. You won't, Ifua said softly. But even if you do, maybe ghosts need love too. He didn't answer. She stood up, gave him a look that lingered longer than necessary, and walked out. He watched her go. The break room light flickered once. He leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes. When he got home the next morning, Abena was awake in bed staring out the window. The sun was rising. The light touched her face like a blessing she refused to accept. Good morning, Kwame said. She didn't reply. He walked to the bed, sat beside her, and placed a bag on the nightstand. I brought your favorite. Kelwell and ground nuts. No response. He sighed, ran a hand through his hair. Abena? She blinked, just once. He tried to reach for her hand. She flinched. It was small, barely noticeable. But he noticed. He stepped back and walked to the bathroom to wash up. She listened to the water run, to the clink of the faucet, to the rustle of his coat, and she said nothing. Outside, the city began to stir. Trotros honked. Roosters crowed. Market vendors shouted the price of oranges. Inside, the silence between them grew larger than the room itself. And somewhere across the city, in a white-walled hospital break room, a warm coffee mug sat untouched, its contents gone cold. The house was quiet when it began too quiet for a city like Accra, where even at 2 a.m. somewhere, a trotro rumbles or a vendor yells or a baby cries in a nearby flat. But not tonight. Not on this stretch of road. Not in the home where love had gone still. Kwame was asleep on the living room couch, still wearing his scrubs from the emergency ward. His neck bent at an odd angle over the armrest, and the TV flickered dim light against the walls forgotten. A glass of half-finished sobolo perched precariously on the edge of the coffee table. The ceiling fan whirred in soft rhythm, the only sound in the room. Then came the scream. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even full-throated. But it cut through him like a blade. Quame jolted upright. For a moment he couldn't place it, dream or memory. Then it came again. Quam. He stumbled to his feet and ran heart-thudding. In the bedroom, Abena thrashed on the bed, her upper body twisting violently as if trying to flee something invisible. Her legs paralyzed lay limp and unmoved. But her arms clawed at the sheets, and her face was twisted in terror. No, 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 get away, she cried. Get it off me. Abena Kwame shouted, rushing to her side. Abena, I'm here. Her eyes were open, but she wasn't really seeing him. She flailed wildly, arms smacking against his chest, her breath hitching between sobs. Please don't bury me. Please don't bury me alive. Quam grabbed her wrists gently, firmly. Abena, listen to me. It's not real. You're safe. You're home. She shook her head violently. The drums. I heard the drums. Her voice cracked and then broke completely into uncontrollable sobs. Her body convulsed forward, falling into his arms. He held her tightly, whispering over and over. It's okay, you're safe now. I've got you. He cradled her like a child, rocking her gently as she wept. The clock on the wall ticked past 3:17 a.m. 30 minutes passed before she quieted. By then she had sunk into a silent, exhausted heap in his arms. Her tears had soaked his shirt. Her fingers clutched his sleeve like a lifeline. He didn't speak again. He just held her until her breathing slowed, until her head rested against his shoulder. But her eyes never closed, and neither did his. The next morning, the knock came at the front door just after 9 a.m. 3 sharp taps. Kwame opened it, still in the same clothes from the night before. Standing there was his mother, Madame Esi Mensah, wrapped in a deep purple kente cloth, gold earrings swinging as she stepped inside without waiting for invitation. I heard she said coldly that she screamed through the night. What evil spirit torments her now? Quame closed the door behind her, sighing. Mother, please. She had a nightmare. It's trauma. The doctor said she mocked, waving a hand. These city doctors don't know our ways. They don't understand what happens when a woman dishonors the ancestors. Quame stiffened. You think this is because of a curse? His mother sniffed. You married a woman from a dancing clan, Kwame. Do you know what that means in the village? Her family rejected the ancestral customs. No sacrifice, no purification rites. And now see, look what's become of her. She fell, Kwame said, jaw clenched. On a rotten stage, that's it. It wasn't spirits. It was wood and gravity. She danced bare-chested before strangers, Madame Essie hissed. Like a wild woman. You think the ancestors don't see that? Quame stepped between her and the hallway leading to the bedroom. She doesn't need this. Not now. She doesn't need truth. She needs rest. Therapy, compassion, not accusations. The old woman glared at her son. Don't lose yourself over this crippled woman, Kwame. His face twisted. She's my wife. His mother stared him down, then turned and walked into the living room, settling into the worn armchair with regal authority. But the poison of her words had already sunk in. That night, Kwame returned late from work. He told himself it was because the ER was understaffed, that the overtime was necessary, that it was responsible. But the truth was more insidious. It was because Afua was on night shift. He didn't seek her out deliberately, not at first. But when he saw her in the hallway, clipboard in hand, smiling easily, something inside him unclenched. She laughed at a joke another nurse made. Her presence was unburdened. He realized with a sinking kind of guilt that it had been weeks since anyone had smiled like that around him. Later, during a break, she found him in the stairwell sipping tea in silence. You look like you need something stronger, she said, taking a seat beside him. Quame chuckled softly. Something stronger might break me. She looked at him then. Not just looked, really saw. You ever just want to disappear? He asked, almost to himself. All the time, she said. There was silence. Then she added, but I stay. I show up. I breathe. That's all some days require. Quame looked at her profile, sharp, thoughtful, glowing in the moonlight, filtering through the stairwell window. He didn't notice how close they were sitting until her shoulder brushed his. He didn't move. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm that tasted like avoidance. Kwame began volunteering for extra shifts. He came home later, left earlier. When Abena asked where he was, he gave vague answers. When she requested help getting to the bathroom, he called for the home nurse instead. His guilt was thick, but so was his exhaustion. And Afua. Afua was always there, not demanding, not judging. Her presence felt like oxygen. One night, a power outage hit the hospital during a late shift. The generators kicked in, but the hallway lights stayed dim. Kwame and Afua were reviewing a chart together when she tripped slightly over a mop bucket. He reached out, steadying her. Their faces were close. Too close. She looked up at him. The air between them crackled. He stepped back. I should. Yeah, she said, eyes wide. Me too. But neither of them moved. Later in the parking lot, she touched his arm. He didn't flinch. Back home, Abena sat by the window in her wheelchair. The lights were off. The night breeze lifted the curtain, just slightly casting shadows across her face. She didn't turn when she heard the door open. Quame entered, dropped his keys on the table. I'm back. No response. He walked to the fridge, took out water, drank it in silence. From the corner of his eye, he saw her hand lift slow, deliberate. It floated in the air, fingers curling, forming graceful arcs. Movements not born of utility, but of memory. She was dancing, with only her hands. Slow, measured, like rain tracing its way down a window pane. She didn't know he was watching. Her fingers moved with such longing, such ache, that his throat closed. He stepped forward. She stopped. Who is she? Abena asked, still not turning. Kwame froze. She smells like hibiscus, she added. It lingers on your shirt. Kwame said nothing. Abena turned slightly, her eyes catching the moonlight. There were no tears, just understanding, just quiet. Then she turned back to the window. Her hands rested gently in her lap, but her fingers still twitched, like they remembered something her body had forgotten. And outside, the wind blew against the baobab tree beyond the compound wall, ancient and unmoved, as if it had seen this all before. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but the room was already awash in soft gold, seeping through the gauzy curtains, like a gentle intruder. Outside, a rooster called from a neighbor's compound, followed by the faint clang of a kettle against a coal pot. Morning in Accra had begun. Inside, it had already ended. Kwame sat hunched over the edge of the bed, his hands laced between his knees, elbows jutting out like wings, folded in grief. Behind him, he could hear the wheelchair creak. A familiar sound by now. But it was followed by something new. Something unnatural. Paper sliding against paper, a pen clicking shut. He turned. Abena held out a plain manila envelope. Her fingers were steady. Her expression wasn't. Kwame blinked. "What's that?" She didn't speak. Her eyes fixed on him, firm and unblinking. There was no bitterness, no fury, just a kind of exhaustion that had gone bone deep. He reached out slowly, as if the envelope might explode. He opened it. It took only seconds to scan the contents. Divorce. Petition. Filed and signed. Her name in bold, her handwriting clear. No demands for property, no clauses for custody fights, no notes of rage scribbled in the margins. Just a clean clinical end. "You're serious," he murmured. Still, she said nothing. Kwame's eyes darted from the paper to her face. "Abena, is this what you want?" A long silence passed between them. "I wanted to dance," she said finally, softly. "I wanted to dance until my bones ached. I wanted to die on stage with sweat and rhythm all over me." Kwame's throat tightened. "But you wanted out," she continued, "and you left. Not with your feet, but with your soul. So I stayed in the ruins alone." He looked down at the paper again, as if it would suddenly vanish. "I didn't know you were hurting this much," he whispered. "No," she said. "You didn't look." Their daughter Amma padded into the room, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She clutched her stuffed rabbit to her chest, blinking between the two adults. "Mama," she said, voice small. Abena turned to her and smiled just a little. "Come here, my love." Amma climbed onto her lap without hesitation. Abena held her tightly, burying her face in the child's soft curls. Kwame stood. He didn't know where to place his hands. Didn't know what to say. "Are you taking her with you?" he asked. Abena didn't look up. "She stays here. Her life is here. I'll be gone only a while." Kwame nodded, and for the first time that morning he felt a coldness crawl under his skin. He reached out and stroked Amma's cheek. She smiled up at him, unaware of the weight hanging in the air. "I'll miss you, Daddy." "I'll miss you too, Pumpkin." Then for a moment so brief it might have been imagined his hand grazed Abena's shoulder. But she didn't react. She was somewhere else now, past the place where touch had meaning. When the cab arrived, she packed only 2 bags. A week's worth of clothes, her medical file, and her dance journals, though she had not written in them for months. The driver lifted the chair into the trunk carefully, while Kwame stood on the porch, arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line. He watched as the car rolled down the dusty road, the silhouette of his wife disappearing into the early morning haze. She didn't look back. He didn't wave. Kumasi. The center wasn't luxurious. It wasn't even particularly comfortable. But it was quiet and clean. Nestled behind a grove of trees that shivered with the wind, like a prayer, the center stood surrounded by orange blossoms and gravel pathways. A small sign read, "Bosom Rehabilitation Institute." It would become her refuge. A nurse named Abena greeted her cheerful and chatty, helping her settle into the single bedroom with whitewashed walls and mosquito netting. "This is a healing place, madam," she said warmly. "No judgment here, only time and breath." Abena nodded. Her voice had retreated since the morning. She spent the first few days sleeping. Not out of tiredness, but from a kind of emotional inertia, like her soul had curled up and gone dormant. Then one afternoon, as she wheeled herself into the courtyard, she saw him, sitting under a tree, reading a small red book. He wore a gray cotton shirt, sleeves rolled, one leg crossed over the other. Only it wasn't a leg. It was a prosthetic. He noticed her staring, but didn't seem bothered. He looked up, nodded once, and returned to his book. She stopped a few feet away, unsure whether to speak. "You're new," he said without looking up. "I am. Don't worry. It gets worse before it gets better." She almost smiled. "And then?" she asked. He looked at her. His eyes were old not in age, but in weariness. The kind that had seen bullets and funerals and betrayal in one breath. "And then you stop counting the days you've lost," he said. and start counting the ones you survived. She wheeled closer. What's your name? Kojo Ageman, he said. Ex-soldier. Ex-everything. I'm Abena Mensah. He nodded. I know. She blinked. You do. You're the dancer. I've seen your name on TV. Once at the National Theater. Before. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Before she echoed quietly. They sat in silence for a long time. A bird chirped in the trees, above, shuffling its wings like it was brushing off sleep. Somewhere in the distance, another patient groaned during therapy. A wheel creaked. A nurse called out instructions, and neither of them moved. The days passed slowly. Abena took her first therapy session on a Monday. She fell. She cried. The nurse said it was normal. On Tuesday, she tried again. She still fell. By Friday, she no longer cried. Not because it didn't hurt, but because the tears had dried somewhere in the marrow. Kojo was always nearby, not hovering, but present. He didn't give advice. He didn't interfere. But he shared silence with her like it was a sacred gift. And slowly, without realizing, they began to anchor each other. One afternoon, she found him staring at a small scar above his brow. There were many on his body, but this one was new. Grenade shrapnel, she asked, gently teasing. He chuckled. No, bathroom slip. Irony. She laughed, a sound she hadn't heard from herself in months. And it startled her. They talked about many things. War, dance, loss, mangoes, regret. The taste of jollof rice in childhood. The smell of mother's kitchen after a storm. The quiet that follows screaming. Kojo spoke in short sentences, his voice low as though he'd learned to ration his words. Abena, for the first time, didn't feel like she had to perform. With him, silence was not absence. It was sanctuary. One night, under the blue cast of moonlight, pouring through her window, Abena sat upright in bed, watching her fingers twitch to an imaginary rhythm. Her hands moved slowly, as if responding to music only she could hear. The Adawa steps, the upper body rolls, the expressive gestures reimagined from the waist up. In the stillness, she choreographed again. Not with her feet, but with memory. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and in the adjacent room, Kojo lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his fingers tracing the outline of the book Abena had lent him, her old journal worn at the edges. He hadn't opened it. He would, but not tonight. Tonight was about breathing, about choosing life softly, one inhale at a time. And far away in Accra, in a house that used to echo with laughter and music, a man stood at the kitchen sink, washing dishes without noticing the water scalding his fingers. Kwame looked around the room. Pictures missing from the wall, dance shoes gathering dust in the corner. Amma asleep in her room, unaware of the change in the universe. And for the first time, he wondered not if he had made a mistake, but if he had ever really seen the woman he claimed to love. The rain had left its signature behind puddles on stone, the scent of wet earth in the breeze, and tree leaves still dripping like clocks that hadn't stopped counting. Kumasi in the hush after a storm always looked reborn. The trees stood cleaner. The clouds looked as though they'd confessed something to the sun, and now floated lighter. Kojo Ageman sat in his usual spot beneath the almond tree, in the courtyard of the Bosom Rehabilitation Center, one hand resting atop his prosthetic, the other holding a wooden carving half-finished in his lap. His knife worked methodically, shaping the edges of something small, a dancing figure. Female, arms outstretched. He heard the wheels before he saw her. Abena rolled into view, blanket across her lap, her expression calm, curious. She stopped a few feet away, under the partial shade, wiping a light mist from her forearms. Is that your therapy? She asked. Kojo didn't look up. No, this is survival. She smiled faintly. That's what I'm trying to find again. He paused. Then slowly, deliberately, he placed the carving down. You ever hear of Tamale 2004? He asked. She nodded. A little, the Northern Uprising. He exhaled. I was stationed there. Special unit. We were sent in after a tribal clash. We thought it'd be crowd control. It turned into something else. Abena didn't speak, her hands folded over the blanket. Kojo's eyes went distant. It was my second deployment. I had 12 men. 2 weeks in, we were ambushed. The market square turned into a war zone. I watched a boy no older than 15 throw a petrol bomb at my friend Isaac. He burned alive. We couldn't save him. Abina's breath caught slightly. I dragged his body into a drainage trench. Kojo continued. I stayed there for 10 hours. My radio was gone. I was bleeding from the leg. I held his burned hand until it stopped twitching. He turned to her. That's the day part of me died. The part that trusted anything. She was silent for a long moment. Then, and the part that survived, he gave her a long look. Still learning how to be useful, Abina looked down at her lap. I used to believe dance was my only purpose. That if I couldn't move my feet, I had nothing left. Kojo tilted his head slightly. But what if dance isn't just in the legs, she asked. What if it's in the eyes, in the breath, in the fingers? Kojo's eyes flickered with something almost tender. Then maybe you haven't stopped dancing, he said. That afternoon, Abina asked the staff nurse for access to the old activity room. It had long been used for storing exercise mats and broken crutches. But with the curtains opened, the light filtered in like melted gold across the floor. She sat in her chair in the middle of the room facing the mirror. At first she just stared at the reflection of her body, at the emptiness where motion used to be. Then she lifted her arms slowly, stiffly. Let her wrists fold, then extend the movements, uncertain. She closed her eyes and remembered the rhythms, the ancient stories her grandmother told in whispers before bedtime of goddesses who danced to birth the sky of rivers that curved in response to a woman's grace. She let that history flow into her bones. Let her arms become the words. A week later, she asked for an audience, not for herself, for the children. There were 3 of them. Titi, a girl with polio in both legs. Mawuli, an autistic boy who hadn't spoken in months. And Akua, born with malformed feet and a spirit too bright for silence. They gathered with curious eyes in the courtyard under the almond tree. Kojo had cleared the space for her. He had even hung a string of old kente cloth scraps from one tree to another, fluttering like flags in prayer. Abina sat facing the children. She clapped her hands once, then twice, then began humming an old folk rhythm, the one her mother taught her during Harmattan nights when the fires burned low and stories filled the spaces between breaths. Titi clapped back. Mawuli tilted his head and began tapping his chest. Akua smiled. Wide, open. Abina lifted her arms. This time her hands did not hesitate. They curled like wind. They extended like branches. They rippled like a river, moving through the dry basin of her pain. Her face told the story. Her eyes were thunderclouds and sunshine. Her breath was the beat. Behind her, a nurse brought out a small wooden drum. A traditional kapalongo, cheesed and patched, but still full of soul. She tapped it lightly. Boom! Boom, boom baba. The rhythm began to pulse, and the children followed. Tiny hands clapping, feet tapping the floor in chaotic joy. Laughter, not performative laughter, not polite, but real, raw, healing. Kojo stood at a distance and watched it unfold. The miracle of reclaiming. The joy that didn't ask for legs. The power that didn't need permission. That night, under a fading orange sky, Kojo returned to the courtyard. He had something with him, an old wheelchair frame stripped and polished. He'd been working on it for days in secret, sneaking parts from the storage shed and repurposing them into a mobile dance stand. He rolled it toward her. What is this? She asked, eyes wide. A new stage, he said. Abina laughed. Not a chuckle. A full laugh like something inside her cracked open and light poured through. She ran her fingers along the smooth ironwork. It's beautiful. He knelt beside her and adjusted the arm brackets. Try it, he said. She placed her hands on the bars, tilted forward, moved. The resistance was just enough to allow a full body sway. He'd engineered the frame to respond to weight shifts. With one push, she spun slightly. She gasped. Kojo grinned. You're flying. She beamed. I'm dancing. The rain came softly that evening. Not hard or sudden. Just a drizzle like mist that knew where to land. The sky over Kumasi glowed indigo. Kojo and Abena sat under the extended tin roof, watching the droplets trace lines down the leaves. The scent of dust and rain filled the air. Neither spoke. not because there was nothing to say, but because silence had become a kind of language. Then, without thinking, without ceremony, Kojo reached out. Their fingers brushed, paused, and then entwined. His hand was rough, hers smooth. His grip steady, hers hesitant. But they held, and held. In the distance, the clouds parted just enough for the sun to make its final appearance. Soft light casting orange streaks across the grass, turning every wet surface into gold. She turned to him, and for the first time in many, many months, she smiled like she meant it. It began not with thunder, but with silence. The kind of silence that settles between two people who once shared a bed. A kitchen a dream now reduced to quiet, chewing at dinner, half-hearted murmurs in hallways and doors that shut a little too loudly. Quaim sat at the dining table in a two-bedroom flat somewhere in East Lagan. It wasn't home. It was temporary, a rented sanctuary, with white walls and black furniture that looked expensive but felt cold. Ifua stirred her soup with robotic rhythm. Her eyes stayed on the table. His stayed on his phone. "You're quiet again," she said, not looking up. Quaim didn't answer immediately. Ifua put the spoon down. "Are you thinking about her?" He glanced up slowly. "I'm thinking about my daughter." "That's not what I asked." Quaim exhaled, leaned back, rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Why do we have to do this every night?" "Because you still carry her shadow in this house," Ifua said, voice sharper now. "You're here, Kwame, but your soul hasn't moved." "That's rich," he muttered. Coming from the woman who couldn't wait to fill her shoes. Her face stiffened. "Excuse me. You knew what you were walking into. Don't act surprised that ghosts live here." Ifua stood pushing her chair back. "I wasn't asking for a haunted house. I was asking for a man who meant what he said when he left his wife." Kwame didn't respond. Instead, he rose, walked to the window, and stared out into the night. The truth was, even he didn't know what he was anymore. A husband numb, a father distant, a doctor disillusioned. A man. The definition blurred more each day. The next morning, he arrived at work, late eyes, bloodshot, collar askew. In the staff room, a brown envelope waited on his desk. No name, just a stamped seal from the Internal Audits Department. He opened it. Inside, two documents. One was a formal notice an investigation had been opened into discrepancies regarding the sale of a jointly owned property. The other was a summary sheet from the land registry listing the buyer's name, the date of sale, and the authorization signature. His own. Quaim's breath caught. He had signed it 6 months ago alone, without Abena's consent. Before the divorce was finalized, before the title was split. He had forged the dual consent line using a practiced hand and a shallow conscience. At the time, it had felt necessary, desperate even. But desperation now had a paper trail, and someone had noticed. By noon, Human Resources summoned him. The hospital board had been informed. A full inquiry was underway. A temporary suspension was advised, until the investigation cleared. Pending disciplinary action, the words echoed in his ears. He left the office with a file under one arm and a shadow behind his back. Nurses whispered as he passed. A doctor in the elevator avoided eye contact. In the courtyard, Ifua called after him. He ignored her. By the time he got home, she was waiting. "You've been suspended?" she asked. He nodded once. She crossed her arms. "What's going on, Kwame?" He stared at her. "You really want to know? I live with you. I deserve to." He dropped the file on the table. "I forged my wife's signature, sold the house, took the money, all of it." Ifua's mouth opened, then closed. "You stole from her," she whispered. "I needed to start over. With me." He didn't answer. Ifua stepped back, shaking her head. "I thought she broke you, but you were already cracked. I was surviving. You were scheming." The argument bled into the night. Words thrown like stones, accusations, regrets. She cried. He shouted. She packed a bag. He didn't stop her. By morning, she was gone, and Kwame was alone again. But this time, there was no hospital to escape to. No coat to hide behind. No patient to save. Just silence and shame. The fallout came fast. Social media got wind of the scandal. Doctor steals from paralyzed wife. A local blog wrote a salacious piece linking his medical license to corruption. The comments were merciless. He didn't just leave her. He robbed her. Wickedness in human form. God will judge him. His own family didn't call. His phone vibrated with texts from relatives, each one colder than the last. Uncle Kojo, your father would have disowned you. Cousin Akua, don't come near our house. His younger brother Michael, you sold out your name. I have a wife. Stay away. Only one voice broke through the noise, his mother, but not with comfort. She was hospitalized 3 days after the news broke. High blood pressure. Stress-induced arrhythmia. When he arrived at the ward, the nurse looked at him like a stranger. She doesn't want to see you, she said. Quaim stood by the window watching his mother from afar. Tubes in her arms, oxygen puffing gently from her nose. Her eyes, once so fierce, now distant and cold. I raised a son, she had said last year, not a coward. Her words now echoed like a curse. Emma no longer called. He tried once, her aunt answered. She doesn't want to speak with you. Please, he said. Just let her know I called. She knows, came the reply. That night, Kwame walked through the streets of Makola. No destination, no plan. He passed vendors packing up yams, children carrying basins on their heads, a preacher shouting through a crackling speaker. No one looked at him, but he felt visible, naked. His shoes were dust-covered, his shirt untucked. He sat on the edge of a sidewalk beside a tailor's shop and buried his face in his hands. The weight was unbearable, not just of what he'd lost, but what he had become. He remembered the night Abena fell. The voice on the phone, the terror, the rush to the hospital, the vow he whispered by her bedside. I'll never leave you. He broke it. He broke everything. Now he was a man with no job, no partner, no family, and no redemption. The wind shifted. A group of boys ran past him laughing, chasing each other. One of them bumped into his knee. Sorry, uncle, the boy called back. Quaim looked up. There was kindness in the voice, unaware, innocent. He wept, not the quiet kind, but the raw animal cry of a man who had finally run out of lies. And across the city, beneath the calm trees of Kumasi, a woman danced. Not for applause, not for cameras, but for her own healing. And she did not know that the man who left her was unraveling thread by thread, alone, unseen, undone. The courtyard had never looked like this before. A ribbon of sunlight danced through the tree branches overhead, dappling the earth in flickering gold. Mats were laid across the center square of the rehabilitation center, ringed by folding chairs borrowed from nearby schools. The walls were adorned with strips of dyed kente cloth, fluttering like little waves of spirit. There were no banners, no microphones, no orchestra, just heartbeats, breath, and hope. At the center sat Abena. Her hands rested gently on her thighs. She wore a loose white blouse and a skirt that draped like river silk across her lap. Her face was calm, her eyes glimmering with purpose. Around her, 3 children sat in chairs and on low stools. Titi, Mawuli, and Akua, all dressed in earth-toned outfits, sewn from scraps by the local seamstress who donated her labor in secret. A nurse struck the side of a wooden drum with her fingers. Boom! The courtyard fell silent. Then Abena lifted her arms, and the performance began. It wasn't like any dance the guests had expected. There were no feet pounding the ground, no leaps into the air, no spinning skirts blurring into color. This was different. Intimate. Bare. Her hands moved with a grace and slow precision. Fingers flowing like smoke arms, arcing like the branches of baobab trees. Her face transformed. With each motion she told a story. A woman who had fallen. A soul who couldn't walk. A mother who watched the world from a window while grief built itself a home in her chest. And then rebirth. Mawuli stood and extended a palm. Akua clapped softly, rhythm filling the space between silence. Titi's arms flared upward, like wings stretching after a long sleep. Together the children danced, not with their legs, but with all the music their bodies could still remember. It was not flawless, but it was full of something more rare truth. A journalist from Ghana Heritage Weekly had been invited by a friend of Kojo's who believed something extraordinary was happening here. She stood near the back, eyes wet, fingers scribbling furiously in a weather-worn notepad. Later that evening, she would publish a story titled The Dance That Needs No Legs. Inside a miracle of motion and memory in Kumasi, it would travel to Accra, to Tamale, even as far as Lagos. The footage captured on a borrowed handheld camera would reach thousands of screens, filled with children who clapped with hands instead of feet, and a woman in a wheelchair who danced with her soul. But in that moment, Abena knew none of this. She only knew that she was whole, that her story had not ended, that her body had found its rhythm again, even if it moved differently now. After the applause, after the hugs and quiet gasps from the staff and other patients, Abena sat alone beneath the same almond tree where Kojo had first told her about Tamale. He appeared beside her without a word. In his hands was a gift, small, circular, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a thread. She took it carefully, her fingers brushing against his, unwrapped it. A drum, no larger than her palm. Carved carefully along its body was an Akan proverb, etched in soft relief, being kabi. She whispered it aloud, "Let no one bite another." Kojo nodded. "It means don't seek revenge, don't continue the cycle of hurt." She looked up at him, tears rising. "You made this." He sat beside her legs, stretched out in the grass. "I thought, if you could carry music in your hands, even when you're alone, maybe it would remind you that you never lost your power." Her lips trembled. She reached for his hand and squeezed it, not out of romance, but out of deep, sacred gratitude. The next morning, Abena wheeled herself to the nurse's office and asked to make a call. It took 3 tries to reach her sister. "Ama's here," the voice said, cautious. "Please, may I speak to her?" There was a pause, then footsteps, and then Mama. Abena's heart nearly gave out. "Ama, my baby." The silence on the other end was heavier than any word. Then the child sobbed. "Mama, why did you leave?" Abena wept. "I'm sorry," she said. "I was broken. But I'm trying, Ama. I'm trying to become someone you can be proud of again." "I miss you," the girl whispered. "I miss you more. I want to see you." Abena looked out the window, voice trembling. "Come to me." When Ama arrived, she wore a red dress and a yellow ribbon in her hair, the same ribbon Abena had tied the day before the accident. She stepped off the bus, holding her aunt's hand, uncertain, until she saw her mother waiting in the courtyard. Wheelchair, white blouse, drum in lap. She froze, then ran. No hesitation, no fear. Just open arms. Abena opened hers too. Ama crashed into her chest, and the dam broke. They cried together openly, publicly. The nurses looked away. Kojo bowed his head. But for mother and daughter, the world disappeared. "I never stopped loving you," Abena whispered into her daughter's hair. "I know," the girl said. "I knew it. Even when they said you were too sad." Abena pulled back, brushing the child's cheeks. "Do you want to see how I dance now?" Ama grinned through tears. "Yes." That night, Abena watched her daughter sleep on a mattress beside her bed. Kojo sat nearby, fixing a wheel on her mobile dance frame. She turned to him. "I've made a decision." He paused. "I want to open a center," she said. "For children like these. For women like me. A place where the broken learn to move again. Not to be perfect. Just to feel the rhythm again." Kojo looked up. "You'll need space, funding, staff. I'll figure it out," she said. "One movement at a time." He smiled. "Then let's build it." And in the quiet that followed, the two of them sat under the stars, dreaming not of what they lost, but what they were about to create. 3 years later, Kumasi had become a place of legend, not because of war or politics, but because of a woman in a wheelchair and the way she made forgotten children move with glory. The once humble courtyard of the Bussum Rehabilitation Center had transformed. Where there were once old mats and borrowed drums, now there stood a stone-paved performance ground, shaded by a towering baobab tree. The same tree Kojo had once called the patient elder of the land. Lanterns dangled from its branches like glowing fruit, and the air buzzed with songbirds, audience chatter, and the scent of roasted corn. It was the center's 3rd annual outdoor showcase, the Breath of Motion, they called it. No tickets, no sponsors. Just benches full of people who had come from villages and towns to see something that made them feel human again. Abena sat center stage, her chair dressed in flowing green fabric arms, lifted in poise. Children surrounded her, all dressed in shades of earth and sky browns, blues, saffrons. Some on crutches, some in wheelchairs, some with missing limbs, none with missing courage. The drums began low and steady, echoing like heartbeats. Kappa, 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 kappa. Abena moved first. Her fingers sliced the air like blades wrapped in silk. Her neck rolled gently, then sharply, then settled into a stillness so precise it felt like a pause in time. Around her, the children responded, mimicking her flow, shaping their stories into every sway, every blink, every breath. The audience leaned in. A journalist later wrote, "It was as if the tree itself held its breath to watch her." In the last movement, Abena extended her arms skyward, palm open, face to the sun. The children mirrored her, a collective gesture of reaching not just upward, but inward. A dance of reclaiming. The drums slowed, then stopped. Silence fell. Then came the applause. Not polite, not rehearsed. It erupted, roared, rose into the sky like smoke from a sacred fire. In the third row, a man stood frozen. Kwame, older now, thinner, a quiet streak of gray at his temples. He had driven 8 hours from Accra after weeks of indecision. He hadn't told anyone he was coming. He didn't even know what he would say. But when he saw her, truly saw her dancing without legs, but with more presence than anyone in the crowd, something inside him shattered. She was no longer the woman he left behind. She was something else now, larger than his memory could contain. When the crowd began to disperse, he waited, still, breath lodged in his chest. Then he stepped forward. She was speaking with one of the nurses, smiling gently, sweat glistening on her brow. Amma stood nearby, taller now, holding a bouquet of white hibiscus. Abena turned, saw him, and the world didn't stop. It just went very, very still. He took a few steps closer. People moved around them, unaware of the electricity building in the air. A bird cawed overhead. Somewhere a goat bleated behind the fence. But between them, only silence remained. "Hello, Abena," he said softly. Her expression didn't change. He looked down, then back up. "You were magnificent." She nodded once. "Thank you." Kwame's voice trembled. "I didn't come to cause trouble. I needed to see you." "You've seen me now," she said, voice calm. "I came because..." He paused. "Because I'm sorry." She said nothing. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you," he continued. "But if there's even the smallest part of you that can forgive me..." She raised her hand. He stopped. She placed that hand, those same fingers that had taught stories without words, right over her chest, her heart. Then slowly, she shook her head. "No," she said. The word didn't come like anger. It didn't slice or accuse. It landed gently, like truth. Kwame swallowed. "I know I left. I was weak. I was ashamed. I thought I couldn't carry your pain. But I see now that I only ran from my own." She watched him. He stepped closer. "Please, just give me a chance. Let me come back, to help, to try." She exhaled. "Kwame," she said softly, "you didn't leave when I was healed. You left when I was broken. That's not something you come back from." He blinked. "I thought maybe. I belong here now," she continued. "To myself, to these children, to a life I built from ashes. You were a chapter, and I closed that book." Kwame's lips parted, then closed again. He nodded slowly, as though understanding something for the first time, not just about her, but about himself. "I deserve that," he said. "Yes," she replied. "You did." Amma stepped forward, then hesitant. She looked up at her father. He bent down, arms opening instinctively. She stepped into them. For a moment, just one Kwame held his daughter. She smelled like dust and flowers and home. "I love you, Amma," he whispered. "I know," she said. Then she pulled back and returned to her mother's side. Kwame looked at Abena one last time. She had turned her gaze back to the crowd, speaking to the children, laughing, with a fullness he had not heard in years. And he realized she had moved on, not out of revenge, not out of spite, but out of survival. He turned and walked away. Under the wide crown of the baobab tree, she watched him go, the light breaking through its ancient branches like blessings. And then, without regret, without mourning, she wheeled forward into the next act of her life. Still dancing, still rising, still free. The summons came on a Wednesday morning. A white envelope slipped under the rusting door of his one-room flat in Ketu, with the emblem of the Ghana Police Service stamped in dark blue. The ink smudged slightly from the humidity. His name scrawled in cold capital letters, Kwame Mensah. He didn't open it right away. He just stared. Like maybe it would vanish if he blinked long enough. It didn't. By noon, he was standing outside the police station, a faded baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. His shirt stuck to his back. The heat pressed down, unforgiving. He walked past the benches of waiting citizens, eyes on the floor, not ready to meet the stares he imagined were waiting for him. A female officer at the front desk looked up. Name. He cleared his throat. Kwame Mensah. I received a notice. She nodded and pointed toward the interview hall. Room 3. They're expecting you. The room was small. The ceiling fan clattered with every turn. A framed photograph of Ghana's Inspector General of Police hung askew on the far wall. 2 officers sat across the table, one with a notepad, the other with a tape recorder. Do you have legal representation? One of them asked. Kwame shook his head. No. You understand the charges against you? Yes. They stared at him for a beat. Why are you here without a lawyer? He swallowed. Because I did it. The room went still. He continued, voice steadier than he expected. 3 years ago, before the divorce was finalized, I signed documents authorizing the sale of our marital home. I forged my wife's consent. I kept the money. All of it. The officer with the recorder raised an eyebrow. I know it was illegal, Kwame said. I knew it then, too. I didn't care. I thought I deserved a new start. That I was owed something. Do you regret it? He paused. Yes, he said finally, but not because I got caught. He looked them both in the eye. I regret it because I'm not the man I told my daughter I'd be. The questioning continued for another hour. They asked him about financial records, dates, names. He answered all of them. No hesitation, no excuses, no anger. When it was over, they told him he would receive a date for a court appearance, that he was free to go for now. But the investigation would move forward. He stood, nodded, walked out. And for the first time in years, he felt lighter. Not absolved, but honest. That night he returned to his flat. The walls were the same. Stained, peeling. The single window rattled slightly in the evening breeze. A cockroach darted across the floor near his sandals. He didn't move to kill it. He sat on the mattress and stared at the only photo that still stood upright on the shelf. Amma, 6 years old, in a blue school uniform. A ribbon in her hair. Gap-toothed grin. Her eyes were Abena's. He picked up the frame, wiped a streak of dust from the glass, and cried. Not the rage-filled tears of a man who'd lost the world, but the quiet, exhausted tears of someone who had finally painfully looked into the mirror. The next morning he began to write. He didn't rehearse it. He didn't start over. He just let the words fall like rain. My dearest Amma, I don't know if this letter will find you or if you'll want it, but I needed to write it. I was not a good man. I was not a good husband. And for a long time I wasn't even a good father. I left your mother when she needed me most. Not because she failed, but because I did. I took what wasn't mine. I abandoned what I vowed to protect. And I know saying sorry won't erase what I've done. But if there's any part of you that still holds a space for me, even if it's small, I want to be better. Not for myself, but for you. I won't come knocking. I won't intrude. But if one day you decide I'm worth speaking to, I'll be here, waiting. I love you always, even when I didn't know how to show it. Bah! He folded the letter carefully, addressed it to the only place he was sure they would receive it, the Kumasi Center. He walked to the nearest kiosk and paid for postage with the last coins in his pocket. Then he went home and waited. The letter arrived 4 days later. Abena sat in the community room going through class rosters when a nurse handed her the envelope. From him. She stared at it for a long time, then opened it. Her hands trembled, but not from anger, from memory. She read it once, then twice. By the third time, the tears were falling freely. Kojo entered quietly and saw her weeping. He didn't ask. He just sat beside her. When she found her voice again, it was barely a whisper. I hated him for so long, she said. I know, but I hated myself more. For loving him. Kojo looked at her. And now, she folded the letter. I don't hate him anymore. He waited. Don't need him anymore. That evening she wrote back, not pages, just a single message. Kwame, con gái vẫn cần cha, nhưng không cần bóng ma của mẹ. If you want to be present in Ama's life, do it as a man who walks forward, not backward. She will decide if she's ready. Abena. 3 days later, Kwame received the reply. He sat on the floor of his flat and read it over and over. Then he leaned back against the wall, and for the first time in years, he didn't cry. He smiled, because there was still a road ahead, and this time he would walk it, not to earn back love, but to become the kind of man worthy of it. The sound of drums began before dawn, low at first like a heartbeat waking from slumber, then louder, rolling across the red earth of Kumasi like distant thunder. As the sun stretched its fingers over the eastern hills, the village stirred. Doors opened. Feet shuffled over stones. Children's laughter spilled into the air like bird song. The Afie dance house had its opening day, and the world showed up to watch. By mid-morning, the compound was filled. Villagers in bright kente wraps, city folks in polos and sneakers, elders draped in traditional smocks, seated beside teenagers with mobile phones. The mayor of Kumasi arrived in a charcoal suit, fanning himself under a white canopy, nodding solemnly at the speakers beside him. A carved wooden sign arched over the entrance. Afaya Dance House, where broken feet still fly. Built on the land behind the rehabilitation center, the space was open-air arched walkways of red brick shaded platforms under woven thatch. And at its heart, a wide circular stage paved with river stones polished to a glassy sheen. No steps, no barriers. A place designed for bodies of every kind. A hush settled as Abena wheeled herself to the center of the stage. She wore white soft cotton that flowed with every movement. Her hair was braided with shells. Around her neck, the small bean ka bi drum Kojo had carved her years ago. She held a microphone, but she didn't need it. Her voice carried. I used to believe my life ended when my body broke, she said. But I was wrong. My life began again when I let go of who I thought I was supposed to be and embraced who I had become. A pause. In this place, we don't dance to impress. We dance to remember, to grieve, to laugh, to heal. The crowd leaned in many blinking back tears. This house, she continued, gesturing around her, is not made of walls and floors. It is made of stories. Yours, mine, ours. Welcome. And then she raised her hands and danced, not alone. Around her, children poured onto the stage. Some walked, some rolled, some crawled, some needed help, some did not. But all of them moved arms-wide faces, bright bodies swaying with abandon. The drums thundered, and the village clapped, and Abena's eyes gleamed like the sun. From the edge of the crowd, Kojo stood watching. He hadn't told her what he was carrying in his pocket. Not yet. The celebration continued deep into the afternoon. Stories told under the shade, roasted plantains passed between benches, women ululating into the sky. A child recited a poem about her missing arm. A blind boy played the flute. And over it all, the steady beat of joy echoed through the trees. As the sun began to dip, casting golden light across the courtyard, Kojo walked toward the baobab tree. She was already there, alone, breathing in the quiet. This baobab, wide, ancient, immovable, had become a kind of cathedral. Its trunk bore the carvings of many hands, its shadow a place of stories. It was here years ago that she first danced again, here that she found herself, and now he would meet her where it all began. She heard his steps and turned. You always walk like you don't want to be heard, she said. Force of habit. She smiled. You came. He reached into his pocket and pulled something wrapped in a green cloth. I was told, he said, that in the northern regions, if a man truly respects a woman, he doesn't bring gold. He brings something that took time. He opened the cloth. Inside, a necklace. Simple but unlike anything store-bought. Braided threads of coconut fiber dyed with indigo. At the center, a small wooden pendant shaped like a seed, carved with waves, coiled like a spiral. Life from within death. Abena's breath caught. It's beautiful, she whispered. Kojo stepped closer. I'm not offering you a fairy tale, he said. I don't have perfection. I don't even have a perfect past. She looked at him, But I have today. I have tomorrow. I have every sunrise I haven't earned yet. And I want to spend them beside you. He didn't kneel. He didn't need to. I want to build something that doesn't break when life gets hard. I want to grow old under this tree with your hand in mine, and children who know that strength doesn't come from what you stand on, but what you stand for. Tears slipped down her cheeks. Abena, he said softly, will you marry me? She closed her eyes, not to escape the moment, but to feel it completely. And when she opened them, she nodded, not once, but twice, a quiet, steady yes. Then she reached out, took the necklace, and let him place it around her neck. I don't love you because you saved me, she said. I love you because you saw me, even when I didn't want to be seen. They stood together beneath the baobab tree, the last rays of sunlight stretching across their faces. In the distance, the drums resumed slower now, like a heartbeat at rest. And as the wind moved through the leaves, as dancers laughed and children rolled across the stage, they had built, Kojo and Abena stood side by side. Not two perfect people, but two whole ones. And in that moment, love was not a promise. It was a presence, unbreakable. And finally home. The morning air shimmered with mist, the land still yawning from sleep. Soft rays of sunlight threaded their way through the baobab branches, slicing the haze like golden cloth. Dew clung to the tips of tall grass, and somewhere a heron called across the valley. The stage was not a stage today. It was earth itself. Open, boundless. The drums began. Not the sharp cracks of Capolongo or the delicate taps of Iwe, but the deep ancestral call of the Fantom from. Boom, boom, boom-ba-boom. It echoed across the hills, into the riverbeds, through the bones of the oldest trees. Not a performance, a summons. The land listening. Abena sat in the center clearing, dressed in woven ivory cloths. Arms bare, her chair almost unnoticeable beneath the folds. Around her were the children, now older, taller, some with braces, others with crutches, some in chairs like hers, each with their own story written in the rhythm of their breath. She lifted her hands, and time slowed. Each gesture was deliberate, a twist of the wrist to conjure hope, a sweep of the palm to cast out grief. Her face bore the gravity of someone who had been to the edge and chosen to stay. The children moved in sync. Mawuli, once mute, now beat a rhythm on a small drum, lips humming a melody only he understood. Akua, her malformed feet now grown stronger, moved her arms like wings across her crutches. Titi stood on trembling legs, shoulders square, a queen in her own right. The music swelled, cymbals clashed, and laughter burst from the crowd. Because this wasn't a performance anymore, it was a resurrection. Kojo stood behind the last row of seated guests, arms crossed, heart full. He didn't need to be beside her to feel her spirit. It reached him anyway. This woman, this survivor, was not just dancing. She was declaring that tragedy would never be her final act. Amma sat in the front row, braids dancing, as she clapped, cheeks wet but smiling. In her lap was a notebook. She'd spent weeks choreographing a new piece, hoping one day to perform beside her mother. But today, she only watched and remembered. Her mother once lying still in a hospital bed. Her mother wheeling herself through therapy. Her mother wiping tears quietly while whispering, "We rise." And now here she was, risen. The dance climbed higher. A crescendo of limbs, drums light. The mist burned away with each beat. Sunlight poured across the field like oil. Children spun, reached, cried. And in the center, Abena closed her eyes, moved, smiled. Because this was what healing looked like. Not perfection, but joy born through fire. As the last rhythm faded, the drums silenced one by one. The children's arms lowered, and the clearing grew still. Not empty, reverent. The crowd didn't cheer right away. They simply breathed, and some wept. Kojo stepped forward, stopping just at the edge. Abena opened her eyes, met his. He nodded once. She nodded back. And in that silence, everything was said. Then slowly, everyone stood. Applause began like rainfall. First drops, then flood. Amma ran onto the stage, threw her arms around her mother, whispering something that made Abena's eyes shine. The children circled around laughing. Not performers, but family. The camera zoomed out slowly, over the stage, over the crowd, over the fields of Kumasi blooming gold and green after the rains. And there she was, Abena, still seated, still grounded, but infinite, surrounded by joy, by breath, by story, by everything she had built, not in spite of her pain, but because of it. And a voice spoke, clear, soft, unforgettable. After the storm comes the sun. But only those brave enough stay to see it rise.